Hello, Curiosity Now listeners. This is your curator, Aaron McNally. Happy to be here and happy to have you here as well. And of course, I'm especially excited to have with us today Dr. Gregg Henriques, professor of psychology at James Madison University, clinical psychologist himself, and author of a new unified theory of psychology, as well as the more recent new synthesis for solving the problem of psychology, addressing the Enlightenment gap. Gregg, thanks for being here.
Hey, Aaron, so wonderful to be here. I deeply appreciate it. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, well, happy to have you. I'm looking forward to the conversation as well. Let's just get started here. It's possible that our listeners weren't aware that there was an Enlightenment gap or what an Enlightenment gap is. Do you have a thumbnail for characterizing the nature of it?
Sure. The gap is a gap in our knowledge. It's sort of an absence of coherent understanding. And your listeners may have heard of the mind-body problem. So the mind-body problem is, hey, we have this thing. It's this mind. Sort of a father of modern psychology. Some people think of Rene Descartes as the father of modern psychology, and he's arguably most famous for his dualism, meaning the split he does between matter and mind when he thinks to himself, what am I most aware of? What's kind of the foundation of my thought? And he identifies, hey, I think, therefore I am. And he observes the way his mind behaves, the domain of cognition, the domain of thought, the domain of conscious reasoning. And he sees that behaves very differently than the mechanical world, the domain of matter, basically. And he splits the world into matter and mind in two different substances. So you get what's called Cartesian substance dualism, the idea that the universe actually is made up of these two different substances. Very few modern philosophers are believe that it's possible or effective to think about the world as made up of two fundamentally different substances. There's a whole bunch of reasons. But then how do you put mind and matter together? So the synopsis of what the Enlightenment gap is, how do you place mind in relationship to matter? And also it says, how do you place scientific knowledge of the world, especially like physics, our knowledge of physics, in relationship to the social and subjective nature of knowledge? So the Enlightenment gap is we don't have a philosophy that places mind and matter in relationship or scientific knowledge in relationship to subject and social knowledge in a way that gives us a coherent picture and makes sense out of the world.
Right. So what I'm hearing, let me kind of pair it back to you and then you can respond to my echo. I'm hearing that, we're aware of our conscious mind. Descartes was aware of it. He thought that was some sort of essential aspect of cognition, but he thought of it as somehow distinct from the material world, when in fact it transpires within the material world and is a function and characteristic of the material world. So going around thinking that our mind and perhaps other concepts like soul or spirit are somehow separate from our physical reality creates a sense of division, something like that?
Well, right. At the level of, well, then we need to expend it and then say, well, how, if it is one world, what's the right way to talk about it in terms of one world? Okay. So, and then we don't have that. There isn't any. We're completely confused. Makes no sense, I would argue, to try to translate this conversation into physics. Like we can't this isn't about, we can use the language of physics to describe the behaviors of particles in the Large Hadron Collider, but the language of physics doesn't give us anything to understand this conversation. And really,
it'd be a category error.
Be a category error. So what are the right categories? And then how do we place those categories together to give us a holistic, coherent picture of the world? The Enlightenment gap says we don't. We don't have a system that places our concepts in categories in right relation to give us a coherent, holistic picture of the world.
Sure. And before we get into that juicy stuff, let's look at the problem. How do you see the problem if we don't solve this, if we don't figure out how to think about this? What's at stake? What is currently not functioning?
Great. Well, I think that we are, our mutual friend, connection, John Vervaeke, has delineated what's called the meaning crisis. Got
Hmm.
quite well known for his 50-part beautiful series called The Meaning Crisis.
Hmm.
And the meaning crisis argues that modern society is lacking a shared sense of what is true and good. It's lacking a way of socializing people to make sense out of the world where they're experiencing meaning in life. It's lacking a frame for us to engage in the world because we sit in a chaotic, fragmented, pluralistic state of knowledge, coupled to a rapidly evolving technology that is transforming the way we're sort of our intergenerational patterns of knowledge. So we live in a state of what's called aporia, to use John term. We're completely confused, we're unclear, and deeply connected to that confusion is a failure to have a coherent worldview that enables us to place our concepts and categories in right relation.
And so then we get sort of like social splits where everybody sort of fractures and fragments into sort of ad hoc constructions of worldviews that never really are full because they're not participated in socially, something like that.
Sure, yeah, and they then don't know how to relate to each other.
Yeah.
So we don't know how to place. So you get on the one hand, you can get sort of an atheistic, physically reductive claim that we're just a bunch of molecules bouncing around. You can return to more traditional views and say Christianity and reject some of the discoveries of science and return to that maybe even in a fundamentalist sort of way. You can hunt for all sorts of different elements, but how do we orient in the world? The philosopher Nietzsche, when he saw sort of the implication of the unfolding scientific worldview, famously says, "You've killed God and you know not what you've done." And what he
Mm-hmm.
meant by that is that God, although Nietzsche was no Christian by any stretch, the Christian God formed a particular framework of shared value and understanding. And to sort of reveal that to be a myth or a deep-seated problem, and leave behind the idea that it's just a bunch of matter. You're basically meat, just unfolding in a deterministic way. Well, what does that mean in terms of how people get value? So that's just one then broken kind of mindset that emerges, and then we get all sorts of different fractured mindsets. And I'm all for diversity. What I'm actually interested in what's called a coherent, integrated pluralism. There are very good reasons to believe that you may want to emphasize different aspects of reality, emphasize different value systems in different ways, be tied to different traditions that give you different vocabularies. But what is absolutely missing is a coherent picture of the whole that can place all of that pluralism in any degree of relation that allows us to make sense out of the various perspectives in a coherent way.
Absolutely. And from a clinical psychologist perspective, what is the risk if we don't form a coherent? Like I can hear someone saying, yeah, the world's fragmented. That's just how it is. Chaos
Sure.
is, just how it is. What are we risking, or what are the threats?
Right. Well, I think one of the great threats, since you brought up clinical psychology, is the existential way you relate to the world. That is your sort of propositional meaning-making system that gives your life meaning and purpose and value, and how you tell the story of who you are. Well, there's an endless amount of evidence that suggests that when it coheres with purpose and you can narrate why you and what you do matters in the world, that's a very, very different perspective when it is incoherent, fragmented, and leads to the problem of nihilism, which is like, it doesn't matter at all what I do. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
existentially at a propositional level, if you sit in a world and it's like, it doesn't matter whether I love my kids or leave them. It doesn't matter whether I go to my job. It doesn't make any difference what I do in the world. And oh, by the way, I'm going to believe this today and I'm going to believe this tomorrow. And all of it is basically just stuff that's happening by chance and randomness, and I'll just then die. Well, if that's your existential meaning-making narrative for how you get along in the world, you got problems. And
Mm-hmm.
we are seeing a major mental health problem across the West. And quite frankly, we're seeing it most obviously show up in our youth. We're seeing a massive, and I think that has a lot to do with as you come along in adolescence, your task is to develop an agentic identity an adult human person narrator, an egoic narrator that navigates the social field and says, oh, I know what my place is. I know how I fit in the world. I know how I matter relative to the larger picture, relative to my ancestors and the people that will come after me. That is unbelievably important for our basic psychological adaptive well-being. And the absence of a coherent worldview means that this thing doesn't cohere at all. There's no sense. So you get massive amounts of identity problems. And if you think now, like, in the news a lot is this whole issue of, transgender. That's just one good example. And I think it's getting an enormous amount of attention because it just shows how confused we are. Hey, what is gender? And is it okay if you're, born with a certain set of chromosomes and have a certain physiology to just wake up one day and say, I'm going to go the other way? Is gender a total social construction? All of that. And without getting into the details of that, it just points to the amount of confusion. And then when we look symptomatically, what you get is you get anxiety, you get depression, you get vulnerability, you get confusion, you get lack of purpose. And that we are seeing sort of epidemic levels of those kinds of problems in our youth.
Yeah, I can see two, among many unfortunate scenarios. One being, oh, fuck it. I don't matter anyway. Life is so tedious. I'm just going to kill myself. That's one thing I can think of. Another thing I can think of is, hey, fuck this. I'm going to go out and do something about this malaise, and maybe I'm going to shoot up a bunch of people at a concert, or I'm going to, plan a bomb or something like that. How far are we from the type of, I'd hate to just call it this, but the primate self, or how far are we, any one of us, from that capacity for violence if we don't address a situation like this?
Well, I think you are. You're pointing to the certain kinds of potentialities, and different people, different dispositions will have different, potentialities for manifesting this nihilism, this confusion, this fuck it doesn't matter in different ways. The most common is a sense of depression and futility. So you're going to see that the most. And then to the extent that manifests itself in violence, that would be violence directed toward the self. And we are seeing, consistent with what I highlighted in the mental health crisis, record levels of suicide. Okay, so people are killing themselves at record rates. It's a national tragedy. I think that suicide is the second leading cause of death of people between 18 and 33. I think it's the second leading between. I believe it's the second. Wow. Accidents are first. I think suicides are now past diseases in terms of the frequency with which people are killing themselves. So your point, hey, does this what happens? Oh yeah. And then sometimes for individuals who have a propensity for destructive hostility, and that can be both a dispositional sort of genetic, not like it's determined by your genes, but genes will give you a tendency towards aggressive hostile disposition. And then that's coupled with all sorts of, what kind of messages are given by society, how alienated and hostilely destructive does somebody feel, what is their opportunity to get a hold of an AK-47 and release that. And of course, since Columbine, if you're paying any attention, there's been an explosion, pun intended, reference intended, of these mass shooting events in the United States, at least. So that now we're seeing this as a regular, weekly phenomenon reaching national news. I think that the stats now are, there's more than one mass shooting every day in the United States. And of course, some when there's like the tragedy recently in Maine, where you're getting, killing 20 people or however many. It's a remarkably disheartening phenomenon. And so, yeah, the system for most people will end in sort of an existential depression, a low-grade feeling of not mattering, trudging along in the world, feeling anxious and unfulfilled. Some people that dips into a, sort of a real clinical depression, makes you vulnerable to suicide if you have that propensity. And then finally, for some people, a destructive rage against the world that can get triggered and result in, catastrophe for everyone that's involved in that explosion.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm just going to kind of speculate, and I'd like to hear what you think about this. But it seems like the more these things happen in the presence of a meaning crisis, which is sort of a vacuum of meaning, then all of a sudden the stage gets set when something does happen. I mean, you mentioned Columbine, and then you mentioned the explosion of things that happened afterwards. And I was going to give an anecdote. When I was in high school, we read Romeo and Juliet and watched the Baz Luhrmann movie, and we read The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. And then just only a couple years before that, Kurt Cobain had killed himself. It was a very public thing from Nirvana.
Sure.
And so I was walking around. I kind of felt like it was a little bit like Goethe's Young Werther, where, they talked about copycat suicides. Is there something to that where if in a meaning crisis, if the idea of a mass shooting or the idea of suicide is kind of put into common parlance, does that, do you think, potentially increase likelihood?
Yeah, there's good empirical evidence for the contagion effect on both accounts. So people need to get exposed. If people get exposed, in fact, this actually happened in my high school. We had a contagion series of suicides that actually took the life of my sister-in-law's brother, and two other individuals, and one other individual made a suicide attempt. That was almost certainly they were in contact with each other. They talked about it, but also it was a contagion aspect. So we will see breakouts of suicide following major media coverages. It gives people the idea. It shows you have, at the very least, if nothing matters, then nothing matters. But often a lowest common denominator of mattering is attention. And if you watch other people get attention, either for the Columbine shootings, almost certainly listen, if you have nothing to lose, and then sure, it's a horrible amount of negative attention and other people say you're a horrible person, but you're now at least known. And that's better for some psyches to have a felt sense that you are at least, especially if you're sort of rageful, you've never really been seen, the I'll show you. And then when you watch other people do the I'll show you, make the name, become sort of crazy anti-heroes or whatever in some twisted way. Absolutely, that contagion effect is empirically documented on both shooting episodes like Columbine. Indeed, with Columbine, you see a pre-post effect, very significant. Like pre-Columbine is a very, very rare thing. And then post-Columbine, with the explosion of that, we see it sort of taken off, become part of the national consciousness. And that definitely spreads. And the same with contagion effects of suicide. And something like Kurt Cobain's suicide you would expect an uptick in general suicide rates after something like that would reach the public. So, yep, totally a contagion effect.
Wow, that's really something to be aware of. Kind of going down the clinical psychology path in this context, why don't we just talk about some basic mental health concepts that are in general parlance that maybe get overused, maybe get used a little in a kind of sort of obscuring fashion. Let's first talk about depression. This is something that we hear people say, obviously there are many ways to say this. I am depressed. I'm depressed about this. There's a general confusion about what depression or clinical depression really is. And I've heard you speak eloquently about this. I was wondering if you could kind of give us a good definition.
That's great. Yeah, I really appreciate your drawing attention to this. I think this is super important. It's remarkable to me how much little consensus there is on using this term. And I think it's diagnostic of our problem of psychology and confusion. So let me tell you what I think of depression as being. Depression is a state of mental behavioral shutdown. Okay, I'll say that again. What is depression? It's a state of mental behavioral shutdown. Okay? Well, what is a shutdown, and what do we mean by that? Well, at the kind of the animal layer of your being, okay, the animal, you're an organism, you're a living organism, and then at the base of that, you're also an animal. The animal part of the organism is your neuromuscular sensory motor loop. Okay, basically, it's your brain, your structural muscular body. And what is it that makes you quite different than a tree, or what makes animals quite different? They get up and they move around. Okay. Right, trees do lots of cool stuff, but they don't get up as whole entities and move around. Well, animals have this sensory motor looping system that allows them to get up and move around. And the core of that is that, well, how's it going to invest its action? Because it's expensive and risky. It's going to spend its behavioral investment in particular ways. And it has a behavioral activation system that then gets kind of organized into positive emotion. Behavioral activation, positive emotion is like, oh, you desire that. You want that. When you get it, it's good and it's reinforcing. So in other words, it engages you in the world. It's sort of like the gas of your energy system. It's like, hey, you want that, you desire that, you get excited, you get enthusiastic, you feel pleasure, you learn from engagement in the environment through that.
Is that related to serotonin and dopamine?
Yep, and dopamine in particular, serotonin, the dopaminergic track in particular tracks reward in this particular way, okay? Serotonin is super complicated, but it actually relates more, if we're going to emphasize anything, it relates more to the second side of this, where one is the gas, the behavioral activation, positive emotion, go out there and get that thing, to the brakes, which is, oh no, the world is filled with threat. Oh no, bad stuff can happen. Movement is expensive and risky. So you have a behavioral avoidance system that then manifests a negative emotional feeling focused on danger, risk, threat. You have an anxious, active side, and then a passive, depressed, shutdown side. Okay, that says, hey, the world's bad out there. You're going to get hurt. You're going to get starved. You're going to better just to hunker down and do nothing and hope things get better. Okay. So if you have a gas that goes out and explores and gives you positive notion, and then you have a brake system. Well, when I talk about depression, what I'm talking about is a systematic shift in the gas brake relation. So the shutdown basically means that instead of where normally you have a certain amount of gas that your animal system is like pushing towards, this shrinks the gas, basically pulls off the gas and makes the brake system much more active. So another way of saying that is it makes you anhedonic. That's the technical clinical term for anhedonia. Hedonia is pleasure, and meaning here absence of pleasure. So people, when you're depressed, stuff doesn't taste as good. It doesn't seem nearly as exciting. You don't really feel like doing anything. Okay.
Yeah.
And then so your depression is about pulling that gas down and then jacking up. You feel more pain. You feel more discomfort. You ruminate on things going badly. You anticipate more things will go bad. You look back on failures and you're more likely to remember failures. So depression's a state of behavioral shutdown whereby the gas or the behavioral activation is pulled down. So you feel less positive emotion and pleasure. And the negative affect system and the brakes on the system are really jacked up. And really, you basically, forgive my French, but you feel like shit and you don't feel like doing shit. That is the state. Okay.
Sure.
Now the question is, well, is that a state? Is that a disease state? I mean, is that a state that emerges because of biophysiological malfunction? And the answer is, well, sometimes, yeah. Actually, you can get injuries to the behavioral activation system. In theory, the serotonin system sort of actually serves as an inhibitor of the inhibiting system, and the whole selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors basically inhibit and they regulate the system. So you can wonder whether or not you have sort of the right chemical mix. Now you'll hear people talk about a chemical imbalance with depression. That's the idea that maybe chemicals, the neurochemical chemistry is off key. That's actually a very weak and not a very great model, but you can wonder about, there may be ways in which systems can go wrong. A problem that does happen with some degree of regularity is you get problems with your thyroid gland, and if it doesn't produce the right kind of hormones, you can get hypothyroidism, and that makes you feel kind of blah and down and depressed. So you can get malfunctions in the biophysiology that give rise to a shift and cause the system to shut down. Lots of different things can do that. But just think about it, your everyday world. I mean, I ask all of your listeners to just think about when you get up and you hope for something and then something bad happens. And then you're, 2 hours later, another unexpected bad happened thing. And then you come home and then you lose your keys and you're trying to and all of a sudden you're like, God, this just sucks, right? I mean, this is just, what a lousy day. I'm really, and there's a lot of research. If you get hit by 3 unexpected bad things like in a day, you will go through a mini depressive phase shift for most people. In fact, all of a sudden you'll be like, and then you'll go into a state-based depressed mood, which then usually lasts for an hour or two, where you just sort of feel like crap. And you're like, nothing's going right for me. This sucks. Well, that's a mini little depressive phase shift. A clinical depression is really just extending that across a dimension of severity over time. there's usually a criteria of, well, it's got to be at least 2 weeks, and you have to be in this state more times than not over a 2-week period. So it's really just on a dimension. I do think there are some things to certain kinds of clinical biochemical phase shifts that give rise to depression. But basically, then we just put this depressed mood on a continuum. And when it reaches a clinically significant cutoff, we call that a major depressive episode. It is the case by the time that that's happening, we're seeing a lot of shifts in the biophysiology and brain patterning. I am very hesitant to label that a disease. Since we were talking about shootings and whatnot, one of the greatest, most horrific mass shootings was the Sandy Hook shooting that took place. I don't even remember when it was, 7 years ago or whatever. Well, they did a follow-up. I think it was 2 years after, maybe 1 year after. And I think they identified as half of the parents of the victims. That was like a kindergarten, elementary school shooting. And half of the parents of the victims were meeting criteria for depression a year after that event. And you're like, well, what happened? Did their brains just go wrong? And you're like, of course not. I mean, their life purpose and investment pattern was to take care of their children, to see their children carry on, to have anticipated decades of development, of love, of care, of manifesting reward. And I mean that in the richest human sense. And then all of a sudden have that path of investment and connection and be obliterated and never to be replaced again. Well, that is an absolute, classic, horrific recipe, tragic recipe for the system, the animal system, just to shut down around that. So it's a pretty natural and understandable thing when you put it in that way. There are biological reasons for it. There are tragic environmental situations that can trigger it. There are also more, cognitive, emotional, relational, maybe psychological issues that give rise to how people can get trapped in these vicious cycles of behavioral shutdown.
So let me see if I can make a little synopsis and make a kind of comment at the same time and see how you respond to this. It sounds like, so your animal system, we're biological creatures, although we're minded. And part of this involves the fact that we have brains, which take a fair amount of metabolic expenditure to be able to use. Yep. And this goes into a, pursuit of goals and, better states of being. And that usually runs pretty hunky-dory unless there's a hitch. When there's a hitch, there's such a need for sort of downshifting from that goal seeking so that you can, maybe experience the rest that you need, or maybe not make the situation more tense by adding additional complexity or whatever it may be. But for some reason, that biological system downshifts accordingly. And this can take all sorts of different forms, and it can be experienced in different degrees. When it's experienced in a very significant degree, that's when you're going to need yourself some psychological care. You might even need medical attention. But whether or not you want to call that a disease is a challenge. It sounds like there are a lot of good reasons to not do that, but there might be an inclination to want to do it because, obviously we all want to try to take care of people who are suffering. Am I in the right ballpark?
100%. Yep, absolutely. Awesome. Yeah. One of the things I will say about depression, we're super social creatures, okay? And we lived in a very, very, historically, as hunter-gatherers, lived in a very, very tight-knit social network. So I think the most common thing that it does is it sends out a social signal for needing care and being a little wounded and needing a network of care. I mention that because our current system is essentially sets up this to be a nightmare at the almost opposite, meaning that because we're so individualistic and we don't share the same lives. Now, there are a lot of costs associated with sharing the same lives, but since we don't, people can then isolate. And indeed, we can essentially ask and insist people isolate so they don't bring their shit to us, okay, if we're on a more independent life. So we have a system now where you start to feel in this depressed mode. And instead of being inevitably immersed in a community of care where that signal can get picked up, elders can be around, parents, friends can be around, pick you up and reintegrate you back into the society, and held your disappointment accordingly. Now you just go up to your room, get online, and veg, and now you isolate yourself. So the system can't hold the disappointment in the social metabolic context. And I bring that up because some pretty good research has been done on hunter-gatherers. And there's a pretty good argument that, at least in many hunter-gatherers, essentially clinical depression is almost unknown among hunter-gatherers. One guy did a review of 2,000 indigenous peoples and found one clear case of clinical depression. That would contrast with somewhere in terms of our current youth, adolescent, maybe upwards of 1 in 5 at any given point are meeting criteria, and another 1 in 5 subclinical criteria. So yeah, we're talking about a completely different rate of depression, and so that's one of the big reasons why in the modern world is this black dog of the depression biting so many people is certainly a very important question.
Absolutely, and you brought up the problem of isolation, and it seems to me that is an exacerbation, because if you are already feeling like you're having difficulty navigating a troubling situation, then if you become isolated, well, then you're just compounding an already very alienating experience.
Completely. And in UTalk, we map out what's called the primate heart. And this is mapped out by a thing called the influence matrix. And without getting into details, but basically what it measures and what it tracks, your primate heart tracks your place in the social field. And what it seeks is to be seen, known, and valued. That's called relational value by important others. Okay. And that's sort of, think about those as good calories for your primate heart, is to be seen, known, and valued. And when you have that, you have sort of a base of belonging, of care, of feeling secure. And when you don't, you feel the reverse. You're empty. You feel vulnerable to being further rejected. You don't have any secure base to go out and explore the world. So if you feel like crap and then you start isolating, then you start starving your primate heart, which then feels insecure and can't like it to go out and have any confidence and sort of backing in the social world to go out and take risks and meet new people. It is a very, very clear recipe for a vicious cycle.
This brings up another question I wanted to get into. You were talking about Descartes and the split between the mind and body. You were just talking about, the primate self, and talk a little bit about it. We might, sort of in the same way that we split the mind and body, we think that our thoughts are somehow independent of our bodies, but they're obviously interrelated. To what extent can cognition affect the physical body, and to what extent is it dictated by the physical body?
Oh, this is a great question. Okay. So according to my frame, this UTalk, Unified Theory of Knowledge frame, the way we want to think about this is we want to think about this as sort of nested dimensions. What's a nested dimension? Well, you think about it this way. Let's say, think of your house. Okay, at one level, your house is a whole thing. Okay, and if your whole house shifted one way or the other, all the stuff inside of it would shift. And At the other level, your house is also made up of all the walls and the chairs and anything in there can shift and change the structure of your house. Okay, So your house can be thought of as a whole, and it can move as a whole. And then it also is made up of all its parts, and the parts then constitute it. So the bottom up allows you to see the parts constituting the house, and they influence it tremendously. But the house itself can move as a whole unit and then break up. So there's a bottom up and top down relation. Okay. And that's crucial to be able to understand. And then what you do is you take a bottom up and top down relation, and you use an element from the UTalk system I developed, at least if you're using this. And it's called the tree of knowledge system. And what it does is it says that we want to think about things that are moving around across 4 different dimensions. Okay. And these are operating then at different, it's sort of like houses that are nested inside of each other. And so one dimension is the matter object dimension. This is the dimension of atoms and molecules on the one hand. So these would be the parts that make up the first layer of houses here are their cells. And that gets you into the second domain, which is your life organism domain. And you then are a collection then of these cells, which then becomes a body. So you have a whole body that are then made up of these different cells. And then modeling that is your nervous system. Your nervous system models your organism environment relation, and that gives rise to minded animal. So it can move it as a whole system. So that's not taking the house, modeling it as a whole. And then finally, because you and I are cultured persons, we can turn that whole system into propositional language and start talking about that kind of thought. In fact, that's what the medium of our whole conversation is taking place within that thought, which is a whole nother layer of abstraction. So our talking is both made up of from the bottom, all of the different parts, and then it organizes into these wholes, and these wholes have causal top-down properties. So it's both a bottom-up and top-down process that we need to be aware of. So certainly, if somebody takes a baseball bat to my head, okay, you're going to break up the structure of of my brain. And then if you said, well, okay, at the same time, the reason the guy took a baseball bat to my head is because I called his mother. I made a derogatory comment about his mother, and that caused his body to move over to the baseball bat and swing and crack me in the head. Okay.
Yeah.
So both of those things are absolutely true. We have top-down causation. And I think you can think about this in terms of the culture person plane, and that be mediated by language and justification. And then there's minded animals. That's the sensory motor looping, moving as a whole. And there's the coordination of cells at the living organism level. And that's all nested in the material universe and ultimately on an energy information wave at the fundamental bottom.
Yeah, this makes me think of a concept in Zen that Thich Nhat Hanh called interdependent co-origination, this deep web of causality that is part of all types of entity.
Totally.
So this gets into a question I was really dying to ask. So you kind of looked at all of the different and sometimes competing schools of psychology, noticed that there was, some dissonance there, and you kind of wanted to come up with a cohesive synthesis. And, so some people would say, well, then you would write a book about, you just take all the schools and you'd list their characteristics and compare and contrast them or something like that. But you went down a different avenue. You started working with the theory of knowledge. How did you arrive at the notion that theorizing the characteristics of knowledge itself was essential to dealing with this problem?
Right. So it's really important. There are a couple of different ways to, once you know the story's over, you can begin at the ending and go back, or you can start at the beginning and then and so it's important to, see so if we start at the beginning, I never set out. I certainly did not set out even to solve the problem of psychology. I got placed in a journey where I was like, I had certain things I needed to do the job that were missing. And then I started seeking these things to do the job. And then as I got teleported into a couple of set of insights and then started to follow a trail. And ultimately it leads to the enlightenment gap and the realization that our knowledge systems are fundamentally broken. And I have found a way to develop a unified theory of knowledge. I sure as hell and would seriously caution and warn anybody that's like, hey, I think our knowledge is broken, so I'm going to start with the end goal in mind, and I'm going to build a unified theory of knowledge. That would be, if I didn't do that. I don't recommend people doing that. This is in the rearview mirror. I backed into this issue through a series of steps, and then can now look back and be like, wow, I did make a couple of really important insights. And now I can contrast the knowledge I had way back then, see all the problems that I was socialized into just as accepting, re-narrate them, and then see a massive amount of coherence come out of a chaotic, fragmented pluralism that I can call, it's really a unified theory of knowledge in the context of the 21st century. That's sort of the longer, and the reason you want to do that is the knowledge system that I'm building is fixing certain problems that are located in human knowledge construction at a particular place in time. And that's important to kind of put a little container on it. So yeah, to get to the really answer on that is I did not set out to do this. I was a psychotherapist, and I then encountered. It is the case that the way my mind works, I am naturally. I didn't even have a term for this, but it's just natural. I'm a natural metasystemic thinker, and what that means is I like to zoom out and then seek coherence. Essentially, I want to get the edges of my puzzle piece. If I'm going to build a puzzle, your mom probably told you, find the edges first. Well, I want to zoom out, grab my edges, and then zoom back in. That's my
sure.
So I started psychotherapy. I mean, to have this kind of mindset that you zoom out, you grab a hold of. So I then learned the different schools of thought, and then and learn them within the school. So I'm learning cognitive psychotherapy and behavioral psychotherapy, and I'm learning humanistic and psychodynamic and family systems. And I know there's neuropsychiatry, and I know there's these social constructive perspectives, etc. Mm-hmm. And then my zoom out mentality is, wow, there's interesting things to say, and clearly some key insights and grains of truth that each of these schools have. But when I zoom out, there's no coherence. So I noticed that, and then I was like, well, why do we go with the schools of thought? Shouldn't we go with the science of human psychology? Like, I need a science of human psychology that is framed and gives me a picture that can enable me to do psychological therapy on humans. Okay.
Sure.
And the analogies there are pretty straightforward with medicine. I would argue that medicine is grounded in the science of human biology. And we actually know what the science of human biology is. Humans are living organisms, a particular kind of species in evolutionary history. Humans have a particular physiology, anatomy, and then there's a pathophysiology breakdown that we can then build interventions for that heal people. I mean, and then medicine is the empirically supported, interventions that heal people based on biophysiological malfunction and vulnerability that cause suffering. So I was like, okay, so, well, then should psychological therapy then be based on the science of human psychology that enables us to map the kinds of human psychological, mental behavioral processes that people engage in? What are the kinds of problems and malfunctions and dysfunctions that emerge? What are the kinds of interventions that are known to result in positive outcomes? That's what that made sense to me from a zoomed out view. And then when I started to look at that, as I think we talked about this, I was like, well, what is a big zoomed out view? And I saw really there wasn't any, although on the scenes at the time, this is 1994, 1995, and this is our little moment of synchronicity for you and me. I went to, and I found Evolutionary Psychology, first by Robert Wright in The Moral Animal. That was there was a popular book by then. It got enough attention so that it caught my eye. And that set me on from 1994 to 1996, a 2-year journey deep into, became a nerd and studied a lot and learned a tremendous amount about the whole evolutionary psychology world, and could speak that language, and thought I was going to become an evolutionary psychologist because I thought that gave me the kind of frame that I was looking for. It turns out it doesn't, but I did think it did, and that was where I was. And what it was is, it's a zoomed out view that can frame Darwin's evolutionary frame, at least, is something that Freud and Skinner and Rogers and Aaron Beck, the psychotherapists that I was most familiar with, they would all back into an evolutionary frame at some level. So that gave me a starting point where I could start to ground the schools of thought.
Yeah, and it seems that there's a sort of fractal relationship between that big picture and uber specific setting of just providing clinical care to an individual. If I'm going to provide clinical care to an individual, it's crucial that I understand at least the rudimentary edges of the functioning of their cognition and something of their worldview. If I can understand that, then I can start to address the ways that they're constructing thought patterns around that worldview. And, I can't do that if I don't have just a general sense of a big picture sense of what kind of organism is this that I'm trying to help, and in what kind of cosmos does it exist, et cetera.
Exactly. As a scientist, and it's a fascinating relationship to what is the relationship of science and psychotherapy. But what you just said there at the end is exactly what I felt like I needed to call myself a scientist. I needed to have a scientific narrative that would tell me, well, what is this organism that's in front of me?
Right.
And what is its sort of long, distant, deep historical nature, and where do I put it on the matrix of understanding? And that's my big picture zoomed out view. So I needed a scientific conception of human nature, but then of course set the stage for all of the very complicated relationships between that, what is a general conception of human nature, then into specific individual development, socio-historical construction. I'm using the concept of science, which arguably is this Western set of justifications, and that's embedded in a social history. Indigenous people don't use that. And so you have to sort all that stuff out. But I needed a big picture frame that could do that coherently. I was never given that. And ultimately, UTalk is the product of that, that enables, it's what I realized I was looking for.
Nice segue. So let's talk about UTalk. So first off, let's just talk about the basic stacking or the basic structure of how you go about this. Because I was thinking, not only do you need a big picture with respect to schools of psychology, but you also need a big picture with respect to what is an organism, what is a physical entity, what is a minded entity, what is a mammalian minded entity, what is, a creature capable of metacognition. Why don't you walk us through the various stages of life and kind of show how we are in relation to that?
Lovely. Actually, I'll take the opportunity to do this. I'll do it in the UTalk's got a thing called the theory of the week. Okay. And it's built off of a thing called the tree of knowledge system. And the tree of knowledge is my big picture. You might call it a big history. That's an interdisciplinary set of working initially developed by a guy named David Christian. All big history frameworks, and I consider what I'm going to share a big history framework, is a zoomed out view that places the universe on the two dimensions of time, so from past to present, and complexity, or technically, the more technical word I would like to use is complexification, but I'll just use complexity for short. So a time by complexity picture of the universe. Okay. And so
we're going back to the Big Bang, folks.
We're going back to the Big Bang. In fact, we're going to start it Monday before the Big Bang.
All right.
We're going to imagine just an empty void. Okay. So this is Monday is called Void Darkness Day. It's just the before of anything. That will just at least be the negative backdrop contrast to the beginning of the observable universe. And we're going to call that Tuesday, which is Energy Information Day. So now if you take a standard view of cosmology is sort of the science of the universe writ large, and you run the scale back, remember we're going back in time. If you keep going back, ultimately our model, our best working model, there is some controversy about this, but it's pretty consensually agreed upon, is that essentially you go further back, and essentially what you do is you vacuum out all the time, all the space, and even all the matter particles, and you're left with essentially this sort of pure energy system. That's a complicated set of arguments, but basically there is this initial state that I like to call the pure energy information implicate order. And that's where the universe starts. And Tuesday is Energy Information Day. And that's even before space and time and normal sized material objects exist. So we start at the void, and then from the void, we have this ultimate substance that we'll just call pure energy information, and that we can align with Tuesday. And I'll use that just to help folks remember this. And then out of that, the Big Bang refers to a phase shift, whereby out of that unbelievably hot, unbelievably dense system, there is a differentiation, a diffusion, an inflation, and there's a chunking where this energy gets frozen into chunks of matter. There are things called fermions. A fermion is a particle like an electron. And a fermion, something about an electron, unlike the even more base particles like a photon, is an electron. Two electrons cannot occupy exactly the same state at exactly the same time. And that actually gives rise to, when that happens, when electrons form, then all of a sudden there's a related sort of chain reaction, and that gives rise to the dimensions of space and time. And this gives us Wednesday, which is matter object day. And this is out of sort of the ground of, quantum field fluctuations come particles, and then they form into atoms, and they form into molecules, and they get into scales across into rocks, into planets, into galaxies, and they give us the normal sized objects that we interact with, and then very large objects, all the way up to galaxies and superclusters. So Wednesday is then matter object, and this is the first real clearly identifiable plane of existence, at least for us. And we get Newtonian classic physics and chemistry and astronomy and earth science. They will help us see this matter object dimension and map it scientifically. And you are a material object. You're made up of the interesting book, I think The Atoms Within You or something like that I started to read, basically the story of where atoms come from, how they all interact. And then if you took any organic chemistry, atoms are syncing up. A super important atom called a carbon atom. It syncs up and gives all sorts of complexity. We get organic chemistry. And then, we can talk about this, but ultimately another phase shift happens about 4 billion years ago on planet Earth. We can talk about what we think we know about this, what we don't know, but nonetheless, we get basically a kind of chemical evolution that does a remarkable phase shift and ultimately generates the first living cells in the form of things like bacteria. So you get then a cell with genes and the capacity to reproduce, and you get the evolution by natural selection operating on genetic combinations, and that gives rise to the second plane of existence, which is your life plane, the plane of the behavior of living organisms. And of course, you are now a long historical, unbroken intergenerational chain of living organisms that have evolved. It's a miracle. How the hell all your parents managed to get, offspring in the next generation? It's an unbelievable thing to think about. And the chances that, that if you look back on history, the chances that you and I would be here is just unfathomably small. Yet here we are. And somehow each one of, starting with bacteria, there's been an unbroken chain of survival and reproduction that get to us. And we are then just a particular kind of branch of an organism that sits inside of a kingdom, a unique kingdom, although there are other important kingdoms, and I don't want to overshoot the uniqueness, but there's the animal kingdom. The animal kingdom breaks off. And the earliest animals are about 7, 8, even 900 million years ago. But there's a real important moment in the evolution of the animal kingdom called the Cambrian explosion. That happens about 530 million years ago. And that's when you really get brains and complex active bodies. And it's probably when animals started eating each other, when they prey and predation on each other, because now all of a sudden you have the capacity to move. Early animals just ate, the other bacteria, they'd eat plants, stuff like that. Now when you can chase others down, you can defend, you can run around, you get these complex sensory motor loops. We're going to call that minded animal. They're minded on top of living. The mindedness is just the property of a sensory motor loop. It is the case that a very important thing happens within mindedness, and that's this capacity for subjective conscious experience of being. This opens up what it is like to be, and we can be confident that there is something that is like to be a dog or a bat. I am suspicious, and I have no real knowledge, but I'm skeptical that there is really something that is like to be a tree without a nervous system. I think you need a brain and nervous system, at least the way we every day, like open your eyes and see red. I don't think trees are able to do that without a nervous system. I think a nervous system requires at least that kind of experience of being in the world. So we get certainly mammals and birds, and I would argue probably even things like insects and crabs, although that's more debatable, would have some kind of capacity for, in Utah language, that's mind too. That's the stuff we can't see unless you're on the first person perspective on it, the inside out view. So mindedness, we get the whole evolution of minded animals from about 500 million years ago to the present. And then we get evolution all the way up to through primates into great apes, and then our hominid ancestors. About 500,000 years ago, we really started doing unique things. And certainly by 50,000 years ago, we were talking and really behaving in probably very, very similar terms And well, I mean, we lack the technology and everything, but the modern human mind by 50,000 years ago was talking, was clearly cultured, was doing all sorts of different kinds of things. And so then you get the cultured person layer on top of the minded animal. That emerged between the last 500,000 and 50,000 years ago. And then we've seen the continued evolution of civilization, of knowledge, and of technology. So we're cultured persons, we're minded animals, we're living organisms, we're material objects. If we go back to the days of the week, Wednesday is matter object day. Thursday's living organism day, Friday, minded animal. We're here today, at least when we're taping this, it's culture person day. So that's appropriate for us talking back and forth and wondering about the human condition. And then tomorrow, we call it God Moon Day. It's sort of like, hey, what's transcendent? What's beyond human? What can we aspire to? What might exist outside of us? That'll be the final. And so that's the layering from nothingness to being itself, energy information Tuesday, to being a material object Wednesday, to being a living organism Thursday, to being a minded animal Friday, a cultured person, and then aspire to what the future might hold, to what God might shine back on us, to what, who knows, aliens that are tracking us. I don't know. You can play around with that in a wide variety of different ways on Sunday, sort of a day of transcendent reflection.
Sure. Oh man, there are three ways I want to go at the same time. Let's talk about, so the Saturday, we're looking at the last 50,000 years or whatever. We have these tongues, and we have our larynx and pharynx are situated just so that our little poison tester tongues, suddenly we figure out, we can manipulate sound with these.
Yep.
And then before you know it, we're getting language. Talk about, this is something you said marvelously when you were talking to Bernardo Kastrup. What happened once we were able to make propositions using language?
Yeah, so this is the fundamental insight that sets me apart in the world in terms of my own understanding of the world, because it's a creative insight that I had. So yes, first off, let's be clear. Other animals communicate a lot. Okay. So other animals sense.
So communication exists before language or
100%.
Outside of it.
In fact, cells communicate. Okay. So cell communication is fundamental. Animal-minded communication, fundamental. So you send signals, they detect signals. I mean, just hang out. What do birds do? And they're chirping songs, etc. Chimpanzees, bonobos, other great apes, they all have certain kinds of calls they engage in. They do all sorts of gesturing. So they have complicated networks of communication, okay? But they do not have human, and the technical term for this is symbolic, syntactical, propositional language, okay?
Yes.
So we just call that human language. They don't talk, in simple terms, in the way we talk. And it is the case that human language is quite different. So let's pause that and just unpack that real quick. So symbolical, syntactic, propositional language. So we got the symbol, we have something that can represent other things. We have the syntactical, we can combine symbols in ways to create statements. And then the propositional, therefore we can say things about the world. That's right. Exactly. Wonderful. Beautiful. Thank you. Yep. I couldn't have said it better.
Great.
And then what the argument is this. So when you have just broken symbols, you can coordinate things together. So you could say like their antelope. Okay. And there's good argument that we humans have good, what's called shared attention and intention, way better than others. So we can form and coordinate our behavior. Like we could engage in hunting better than chimpanzees. We can build coordinating tools better. We can trap things better by saying their antelope and using signals and gestures, and we had a fair sound. Okay. But here's something that their antelope is not. It's not a propositional meaning statement. It's just two words associated together. There's no truth claim that is explicitly made. It's only implied. Okay.
Right.
But it's not explicitly made. When you put it in a syntactical arrangement that then makes a proposition, there are the antelope, you make what I call a positive truth claim. Now, the state of affairs can be then claimed to correspond to this meaning statement. Is it the case then that are there antelope where you say they are? Okay.
Right.
Now, which means then that by
I
creating
can say Gregg said that there are antelope, but I'm not so sure.
exactly
Mhm.
100%, and that opens up the count. Once you have a factual statement, you can then open up what I call the counterfactual negative space of the positive claim. Okay.
Mhm.
And then what this does then is it opens up all the potential for questions to challenge the proposition. So just like you said, I'm not sure about that. Are they sure they're not gazelle? What?
Mhm.
Where do you mean by there? Weren't they there
Mhm.
just yesterday? How do you know that they're there now? Etc.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
And now let's take, so what I then believe happened is once we got propositions, you then have questions that can dock into these propositions. Think about the who, what, when, where, why. Okay. These all open up relevant, possible alternative claims that then enable us to determine the legitimacy of the proposition. And what this means is that once we get propositions, we get a tipping dynamic where you basically are getting propositions that then are quickly engaged around questions.
Right.
There's a dissertation that makes the argument, and this is debatable, whether any other animal has ever asked a question. Okay, we said they definitely communicate, but there's an argument
Mm.
that a dissertation, no other animals ever ask a question. Okay, there's a question.
Yeah.
There is a debate about this. The Alex the Great Parrot is made a couple of gestures in a mirror and asked whether or not he was wearing a color. That was a debate. But so in
Oh.
other words, there's a question as to whether or not any other animals. And in fact, I was going to go at one point in my career. This almost happened, but unfortunately, life intervened. I was going to go work with Sue Savage Rumbaugh, who worked with Kanzi, one of the greatest apes that learned a particular kind of computerized language.
Oh,
And we
wow.
were going to see whether or not Kanzi could answer questions. And ultimately, then this is going to drive to the big answer. When you get into question answer, how do you resolve the confusion? You build what I call systems of justification. Okay. And
Mhm.
what do I mean by that? The issue is, hey, how do you know? And then fundamentally, we have basically a problem of how are we going to legitimize this and how are we going to act? Okay. That's the
No,
problem of justification. And the problem of
sure.
justification is it reasonable enough to believe this in a factual sense? Like, does it correspond? And is it accordance with our values, my value and our collective value? That's called the personal value, the social value, and the accuracy problem. Well, those are the core problems of justification. And now the argument is that actually what's the real relevance realization, to use some John Vervaeke, of the culture person plane? Well, it's the problem of justification. In other words, we have to see what's legitimate. We have to see what our social values are collectively, what each of our personal values are, and navigate the legitimizing of accuracy and value together. The evolution of propositions tips us into question answer dynamics. The question
Right.
answer dynamics give rise to the adaptive problem of justification. And then what happens is there's a dynamic building of systems of justification. And when you see the world that way, the culture person plane that way, you realize, oh my God, right, my whole ego is essentially a system of justification. It builds these propositional networks that legitimize who I am, what's going on in the world, what I ought to do in the relation. It navigates how I think about my value, how I think about other people's value, how I filter
Mhm.
values between individuals, how we form groups of networks that are within our system of justification, how we
Mhm.
build large worldviews, and it just exploded from there. So the argument is that propositional human language is an unbelievably important tipping point, creates the problem of justification, question answer dynamics, and the core glue that forms the culture person plane of existence are these justification systems.
Yeah, and then question answer dynamic justification system 2.0 seems to have in the West sort of spurred up around ancient Greece, where we have the birth of what would become ultimately science, but first philosophy. You see your virtue ethics. What should we do? What should we aspire to? How should we do it? What kind of cosmology and metaphysics is and ontology are our assumptions based on? And then you get Socrates, as
Totally.
represented by Plato, asking questions and questioning the logic and spurring his conversants to go just pedal to the floor on their justifications to get all of the bullshit out and to
I love that. Exactly. So now we can then talk about the evolution of justification systems, okay?
Mm.
And we can see them in terms of oral indigenous, traditional civilization through both the Bronze Age and Axial Age, and then modern systems of justification. And
Oh.
what you're highlighting there is the Axial Age Western point. The most important Western point is I would argue, the pre-Socratic setting the stage for Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Okay, and what you have there is with Socrates exemplified. Of course, this is across distributed a lot of people, but really gets personified in Socrates with the Socratic method is exactly what you say. His refined capacity to ask questions and to reveal underneath what looks like concrete social reasons is a bunch of bullshit social construction, that of opinion and preference that is a bunch of circular logic that because I said so, etc., grounds out into tradition, it grounds out into bias, it grounds out into preference, which you then can't ground into anything that transcends. And so what Socrates really points out is, oh my God, we built these systems of social construction, really a postmodern kind of view, which is like, hey, you live inside of a system of justification that actually isn't fundamentally grounded in the way you say it is, and really perhaps isn't fundamentally grounded in anything that is transcendent. That affords us the capacity to step outside of, and now I use Plato, to step outside of the shadows of the cave that we operate in and find the sunlight of truth. And of course, Plato and then Aristotle both then come up with refined systems of justification. So if Socrates is pointing out the problem of epistemology, you guys can't justify what you're doing, then Plato and Aristotle are trying to build metaphysical systems that give rise to an ontology and refined epistemology that can withstand Socrates' questions and give us a transcendent, philosophically refined, defensible, justifiable view of who we are in the world. And that's what then emerges at the level of a traditional civilized view with refined priests and philosophers is this questionable, how do you transcend the regular socially constructed BS and get into something beyond? We get it with philosophy originally, and then science itself is going to come along and say, hey, well, we actually can get outside of the refined sensibilities of philosophers and what they think in terms of big picture metaphysics. We got to get into mapping matter and motion through mathematics. And ultimately, that epistemology at the level of science is going to transcend, or in some ways, unfortunately, transcend, in some ways, positively transcend the philosophical refinement. UTOC ultimately wants to put the empirical methodology of science in a big picture descriptive metaphysics that actually really does transcendently ground us and give us a coherent picture of knowledge overall.
Aha. So yes, now we're getting into the grit. Without digressing into politics, I'm just going to skim over this. For whatever reason, our culture, our civilization, at least in the West, has sort of in the past, let's say 60 years, sort of shook up the sort of knowledge foundation that had been assumed for a host of social justice reasons. We don't need to get into opinions about that. We can just skate over it and just say that it happened, okay? And it sounds to me, and you tell me if I'm wrong on this, UTOC is trying to say, okay, great, that happened. It provoked whatever kind of propositions and question-answer dynamics that it needed to provoke. Now we're in a serious situation with mental health and civilizational destruction. We have to get some kind of fundamental foundational framework together, or we're just not going to be able to proceed. We're not going to be able to find win-win outcomes. We're not going to be able to survive extinction. We're not going to be able to X, Y, and Z. Am I in the vein of where your area of concern lies?
Yep. And I'll put it so I'm going to borrow from a woman by the name of Rachel Anderson here in her frame called meta-modernity. Okay. And it will help me come back and because I can place it in the evolution of these systems of justification, which we can, and this is it's more of a Western view and it's a snapshot, but it's helpful. So we remember from 50,000 years ago to say 5,000 years ago, we get oral indigenous justification. That is embedded in a relational world, embedded in nature, embedded in a family, in a community structure where everything is local, contextualized, and certainly you build belief systems, animism, there's definitely religions that evolve, but you are really nested in relation. There's not writing, there's not formal abstraction. You basically negotiate your life in relationship to others via conversation, via oral indigenous traditions of stories, and you negotiate yourself in nature, okay? Then we get traditional civilization. Civilization then requires, by the virtue of building cities and these large-scale systems, we have to have more abstract systems that then get intellectuals like priests and other refined individuals that are trying to sort of say, hey, these are become traditional formal ways of thinking about the world that are required so that people can interact that don't have any history. So then you become Christians, and Christians can interact but we're then pulled together by this worldview. The axial... Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say this echoes back to what you were saying with the problem of us not having a sense of our context in our familial histories. You're saying that religions and traditions built around frameworks like that, they offer a place for the individual to feel some sort of sense of groundedness or contextualization within the world. It's a cognitive shorthand to some degree, because you can make those assumptions alongside other people making those assumptions, and therefore you don't need to do a whole bunch of existential legwork on the fly.
Totally. So, and I would argue that if we want to be connected at the civilization level, we need a national kind of identity / religion. We need a worldview that we can relate to. And then that puts us inside of our family. So you think about your family being the oral indigenous world, and then your community and nation being this traditional world. Okay. Then what happens is that we get increasingly abstract and we build science, which then breaks out of both the social constructed like civilization and the subject the relational kind of subjective world. And then it builds this whole abstraction. Okay. And we get modernity that then is cutting across culture, cutting across specific civilizations, and trying to argue that we now have figured out a reasoned way to identify the truths of the world mathematically, scientifically, and we can reason our way towards pure progress and climb out above nature, get control of nature, and create a linear shot towards truth, justice, and progress for all. Okay, that's the modern one way to frame the Renaissance into the modern scientific revolution, into the Western liberal democratic view that then spread throughout modernity. Okay.
A noble project, but arguably wishful thinking and hubristic.
Well, exactly. The thing, Nietzsche is the first really postmodern, and I mean this actually in a positive sense. He's like, you know not what you do. You actually haven't grounded your value structure to be up to the task of what it is that you've set yourself out to do. Therefore, you're going to behave very unwisely. And what the postmodern, more sort of basic, straightforward. And by the way, I deeply embrace this at many levels of its basic point and its goals. And that is that what you actually did is you failed to appreciate the socio-historical context of your justifications sufficiently. Science isn't great at that, and it doesn't really appreciate the social science. It doesn't have a good frame for the fact that actually there's an entire industrial historical complex that is giving you power and legitimizing your place that you're saying transcends all humanity. We all have a right to human freedom. Oh, wait, except you people as slaves, right? And you women. And this is basically the fundamental critique that is like, it was offered as a liberal ideal for all people, yet historically and pragmatically, it was white men in a patriarchy that were dominant and marginalizing everybody else. And it didn't effectively account for that bias and essentially became a self-serving system of justification. In fact, my first intellectual awakening is feminism prior to all this. And I realized, holy shit, basically, a bunch of people do get together. They say that it's freedom for all, but if it's all dominated by a social identity category, in this case, white men, it's going to create a tremendous normative bias toward that identity and marginalize others. And that's the postmodern critique. And we need that critique. But here's the problem with the critique. It's just that. It's a critique. It's defined against the hegemony. And you cannot build a civilization based on the idea that, well, in the past, everybody was oppressed. The people on top were pure oppressors, and so we're just our justification now is just what? To flip the oppressed-oppressor relation. So now we're going to justify the former oppressed now become the oppressors, and that now becomes our system of justification for the future. I mean, that's absurd. On its face, it's absurd. So anyway, the point is that postmodernism is a very important point. but everyone should be very clear. It's a critical race theory. It's a critical point. It's not a constructive system of justification. It doesn't ground you fundamentally in the transcendent values that we all need to build a global system of justification that's up to the task. So it's a point in modernity where the critique opens up and we have to create some correction, but it's not grounded in anything that would actually be constructive. So a meta-modern view embraces the critique of modernity, but actually then returns to issues of modernity, traditionalism, and oral indigenous, and says, well, what are the constructive grounds that we need to build a society that emphasizes particular kinds of wisdom-oriented justifications?
Mm-hmm. And Utah was born.
And Utah, and Utah got born. I had no idea, but Utah actually is all part of a meta-modern sensibility. You look at the primary representations, this garden, this PowerPoint clip art of a tree in a garden of an old myth that also argues that it's the most serious sort of scientific knowledge system around. That's called sincere irony of a meta-modern view. And I didn't know it at the time, but I actually have embraced the sincere irony. And Utah is part then of a meta-modern consciousness that's trying to say we can return to a much more coherent, integrated pluralism view in a postmodern sense, so we can appreciate the critique, ground it, and grow in a coherent, integrated pluralism. And Utah is absolutely part of that.
Well, yeah, let's get into that sincere irony. That's a great phrase. So Utah, the unified theory of knowledge, it has symbolical elements: a flashlight, a tree, a coin, things of this nature. We're talking about, our propensity as minded primates plus of having this symbolical, syntactical, propositional capability. And it sounds like that symbolical level, you kind of just need the symbols. And they're there already. So why not use them? You talk about the day of the week, it's going to trigger associations in people's minds with the 7 days of one of the Genesis stories.
Sure.
You talk about a tree, they might think about the tree of knowledge. And I understand then, you also have the Bodhi tree that the Buddha was enlightened underneath. The flashlight, a fire or a light is generally seen as illuminating something in darkness. This has deep symbolic resonance. A coin has so much resonance about the nature of your civilization, the structure that gives your government or lack thereof power, the ability to create a currency, to have an exchange and interrelation using abstractions, values like money, to be able to create more and more complex systems. These things are there. They're fruit for the picking, and it sounds like you've embraced that, and I said, let's go with this.
Yeah, thank you for noticing that. I think it's kind of some of the most exciting things about the system. It may be also one of the most difficult things about the system. But the exciting thing about the system is, I sort of definitely I see the error, the modern and postmodern sort of academic knowledge error has been historically in this at least time period unbelievably dominated by just propositional thought. Okay, that we can just gain true analytic knowledge through the propositional thought. We need to get rid of all of the old ways of knowing and blah blah blah, and really,
the religions, for example,
religion, and so it's math, it's analytic philosophy, it's writing that around propositions, etc.
Let alone poets. I just want to give a shout out to the poets for a second.
Yeah.
We don't read it like we used to, and even songs and collective singing and things of this nature. But I'm sorry, I'm digressing. You're trying to make a point.
No. The point of it is, and certainly this is just something that John Vervaeke, Ian McGilchrist, many others make, is that we become unbelievably top heavy on our propositional knowing, okay, and analytic knowing. And Utah wants to. It's very clear it is embedded first and foremost in propositional knowing, in the broken propositional knowing claims of the past. So if you look at all, my academic writing is in that tradition, but the actual system itself bridges from the analytic propositional into the holistic gestalt, into archetypal symbols of the tree of knowledge, which then could be a tree of Siddhartha. It could also be the tree of knowledge in Genesis, which is then paired with the tree of, tree of life in Genesis, which is also then paired with the tree of knowledge. That's a total, that's a very deliberate statement that says, I am embedded in the Judeo-Christian historical West tradition, and I want to look positively toward bridging our scientific knowledge with the wisdom traditions, the ancient wisdom tradition of the axial age. Particularly my tradition is going to be a Judeo-Christian tradition based on my own particular place in society and history. And the tree of knowledge and tree of life are explicitly representing that. The coinage representing modernity in many ways, and into a traditional into modernity flow of current and currency. The flashlight, exactly. It's a sign of light. Indeed, it's a light that guides you out of the cave of behavioral shutdown. Is the ComMO flashlight, and so it's a way to shine enlightened knowledge on human misery and neurotic functioning, and guide one away from the deep, dark depths of a depressive cave and out into the sunlight of engagement, of competence, of pleasure, and of feeling meaning in life. So the flashlight is in relationship to that. So what I came to believe is that the digital, which is that is the medium that we're entering. Okay, it's a broad term, basically for artificial intelligence, the internet, our interactive phones, neural links potentially to come. The knowledge systems that are going to be present for us are going to interface across visual, digital landscapes that are going to create imagery, that are going to create entire visual worlds. And the garden and the entire structure really is it may even be a little ahead of its time, but it's the idea of a knowledge system that is embedded both in propositional, but also in visual, spatial, in mythos, in potentially digital interactions that are embodied, that we have contact with, that make connections with all sorts of different aspects of living, not just the propositional analytical structure. So that's part of what the whole design of the system is.
Fabulous, fabulous. And to keep going with that garden stuff and trees and all the symbols and everything, my favorite poet, Coleridge, had this idea, and this goes back to your description of like the origins of matter and of life and all the different stacks of complexification. Certainly Coleridge pilfered this from somewhere. He did with many of his ideas, often unattributed. But he had this idea of the whole is present in the seed. And, he had a mystical bent, and just saying, U-Talk is explicitly in some of its mantras and things open to the concept. And I was really happy that you used this phrase, because I have myself used this phrase many, many times in my writing, my personal writing, the concept of God. And before I get into that, I just want to state very clearly what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a being. I'm talking about being itself. I'm talking about something both within and without, something that influences, participates in, and fuels everything, but is also transcendent and outside of everything. And all of these things, you see, we start to reach the limits of our knowing. Anybody who's really been serious about reading even Western theology knows that all of the good philosophers have really wrestled with this. Nobody has ever just said, yeah, bearded man in the sky is a sufficient description of God. I'm saying this for two reasons. One, because I want to know where Gregg Henriques falls on the sort of spiritual, on spiritual matters, how you think about the mystery of your place in the cosmos, but also because I want to see how you think being open to the idea of God can be of psychological benefit.
Beautiful. Okay. Wow, that's a lot, and we'll see. Hope I get through all the parts, and if there's anything I miss here, let me know.
Sure.
So Yeah. So let me give you a frame about where I started on this issue. So I am raised in what I would call sort of the current and unfortunate um, context of understanding religion in the West. And the current
Okay.
unfortunate context is between a pretty simplistic notion of a concrete bearded guy in the sky,
Hmm.
and the elimination of that as childish through a scientific atheistic materialism. Okay.
Hmm.
So that basically, are you a theist and really believe that more or less there's a personal God that knows and cares about you, or no, you became an atheist and now all is basically just myth in the bad sense of the word, just untrue BS.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've been
Um,
down that road, brother.
Okay. Well, and many people have, and I grew up in a household that was a direct lineage of that, in the sense of my father, who grew up sort of an standard Methodist Protestant, and then had a Billy Graham awakening, so he became an evangelical, where the actual literal truth, not of the Bible per se in terms of young Earth creationism, but the literal truth of the resurrection, the literal truth of a God that actually loves you, the literal truth of a Christ that walked the earth and then left a cave 3 days later, and then walked the earth and then is now by the right hand of God, the literal Trinity, etc.
Hmm.
That in common sense, 10-year-old terms, the way you describe it is the way it is, and that's what you believe in. And then the light went out over a period of a couple of years after he had a conversion, and then 10 years later, the light starts going out, and then he ultimately shifts and becomes a history professor, studying George Washington down the road.
Mm.
But by the time then I come along, I'm in a Dawkins-esque atheistic household, meaning my dad's lost the Christian evangelical faith. He believed in it as a concrete, like a kid would believe in Santa Claus, and then the lights go out, and then the whole thing isn't there at all. So those are the two choices that I thought you had in religion. I'm
Uh-huh.
now happy to say I've grown out of that
Yeah.
misconception. But I think our society, American society, is very vulnerable to thinking in those problematic terms.
Indeed.
I then described myself as an atheist. And then I became a really well versed much more in science. And although I was appreciative of Dawkins' view, I also really wanted to make sure that I identified as an agnostic atheist. And what I
Mm.
mean by that is, an agnostic atheist in this context is, I'm a scientist and I'm trained as a scientist. I ground my knowledge system in empirical data, and then theoretical models of the way the world works. And those models sit with a lot of ambiguity. They absolutely aren't foundational and fundamental. Things can fundamentally change. You're open to new data all the time, and they're absolutely not complete. And they've only been around for a little while. So our understanding of the world is limited. God only knows if they're aliens. God only knows if they're God. God only knows what is the first spark of the universe. A cell inside of God. I am
Mm.
completely. I am not grounded in any kind of fundamentalism. I pick up with empirical, systematic observation and data, and then sense making that stems from that, both in sort of the systematic science sense and my own sense making. So I'm an agnostic. I was for a long time then, throughout most of my professional career, an agnostic atheist. But I did see, I was socialized to see more of the problems of religion. And then over time, I realized, oh my God, the sophisticated people in religion don't think about it as a 10-year-old version of a personal being. That's not the way you need to think about God. So what you said
Right.
there, I was late to the game based on my upbringing. And then I started reading much more broadly. And I become, ultimately, thanks to the philosopher Alexander Bard, I become a syntheist. A
Oh.
is what's called syntheism is the God you create. Okay.
Oh.
Syntheism is the God you create. So I'm an agnostic, meaning I'm not fundamentally grounded in knowledge of the universe. I don't have that. I'm a talking ape. At least that I think I know that I'm a talking ape. And there's no way that my conception of the universe could be anywhere up to the task. And God only knows, I like to say, what the ultimate nature of reality is.
Although
I'm
you're a very self-aware talking ape, Greg, I must
Okay,
say.
well, yeah, I think I score pretty high on self-awareness among talking apes. I'll take that. But that's still pretty humbling relative to the size of the universe, even as we know it, and knowing that that's
Hmm.
not complete. So I'm a humble talking ape when I'm thinking about the vastness of the universe. and the amount of our ignorance. And I'm atheistic, meaning that all of the personal gods that I hear of, I don't relate to as real entities. I relate to them more like Santa Claus. Like when you give me your concrete 10-year-old version, I find myself deeply skeptical that that is a good ontological description of what you're talking about that really exists in the world. So I have the Santa Claus conception there. And now I'm a syntheist, which means I believe in the God who create. And here's how we put it in our credo, we have a Utah credo, which is a belief value structure, mantra structure. And our 10th belief, we have 10 beliefs, 10 values, 10 mantras. The 10th belief is I believe in the concept of God, which is where we started. And here's what I mean by this, okay? So I'm going to start with two really easy statements that come off of this, okay? And the first one is I believe that the concept of God makes a difference in people's life. Okay?
Yes.
This is not a controversial statement, I don't think, especially if you're, unless you're some sort of weird reductionist. People believe in God, they build temples, they go to church, they talk to God, they have wars over God. The concept of God has a huge impact on people's lives. So this is the unbelievably simple statement, but I want to stay kind of concrete at first and be like, I believe the concept of God has an impact on people's lives. Okay. Now I'm going to shift the meaning of the word belief, and then I'm going to contrast this with the new atheists like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, where I believe in means I'm willing to invest in and see the positive for. So the new atheists just think it's a bad idea. But I actually think, well, God shows up in all sorts of different reasons for all sorts of different possibilities. And I believe that there is an enormously important power to be harnessed off the concept of God. Okay. And a way to say this is I believe in the concept of the transcendent. I believe that we can do better. I believe that we can become more. I believe that we can orient toward goodness, truth, and beauty. And I believe that the concept of God could serve as a placeholder for that. And I believe it has served as a placeholder for that for many, many peoples across many, many different contexts. And I believe it's a necessary affordance and opportunity in society to have available. And I believe it's totally justified to have that as available to us. So the concept of transcendence is meaning transcending your ego, getting connected to oneness, being oriented toward truth, goodness, truth, and beauty. So those are the two meanings that we start with. And then the last or more concrete meaning, well, how do I believe in the concept of God? And you may know this, but part of one of Utah's key ideas is the concept called the elephant sun god. And the elephant sun god is this iconic representation. As I went through the various religious traditions, as I thought about what God would mean to me as I project onto the world, as I thought about what would be an iconic representation of orienting light that's meaningful to me, I created this icon of the elephant sun god. It's a pull off of, well, the sun as a sense of light and of power and of nourishment, as we're all dependent upon. It connects to the Bronze Age god of Ra in the Egyptian world, and sort of one of the most powerful gods in Egyptian lineage. The elephant connects to Ganesha and the Hindu god of intellect, of good fortune. It also connects to me because I use the metaphor of the elephant and from John Godfrey Saxe's poem, where a bunch of blind men have a fragmented view of knowledge, and we can see that they grab a hold of the leg and they call it a tree trunk, or they grab a hold of the tusk and they call it a spear, and the elephant's trunk is like a snake. It's actually, all those are partially true, but they're also limited because you don't see the whole. We can now see the whole. And so here I am as a modern scientist, seeing the whole and then connecting that to Hindu religion, Bronze Age religion. And that's sort of the arc then of sort of a meta-modern view that connects to modernity, that connects to axial age and Bronze Age traditions, that connects to the ultimate energy and source of living that I want to be oriented to in an aspirational way. Well, that's my icon of the concept of God. And so the elephant sun god is how I then manifest my own belief in the concept of God.
It's pregnant with potential. Gregg, how can listeners check out UTalk? Where can they go to learn more?
Yeah, that's great. So we have built a UTalk circle, which I can send you. So that's a couple hundred people that are really interested in UTalk. That's how they can stay up to speed on it. There's currently a unified theory of knowledge website, which is in the process of getting upgraded. I'm happy to say we're going to develop a better more user-friendly website, we'll share that. But for now, I'll give you the 2020 website that's got a lot of information on it. You can also check out my Theory of Knowledge blog. And finally, I'll also leave you my email address so that people can reach out to me if they have questions.
Excellent. We'll put all of that information in the show notes and in the article on the Substack post. Gregg, it has been an express pleasure talking to you. You have a brilliant mind and a brilliant capability to articulate very difficult and complex ideas succinctly. And I thank you so much for the time you spent here today.
Aaron, you're a joy. As soon as we had our first contact, you brightened my spirits because I see you as a deep and profound good soul in the world. And man, do we need those. And it's been a real joy to spend the 2 hours with you.
Oh, such a compliment to hear that. Thank you very much. You take care.
All right. You take care too.